We'd like to thank you for joining us for our first quarter 2017 webinar. The title for this webinar is Climate Change and Equines, and we'll be talking a little bit about how weather affects horses and the horse industry. Before we begin, there's a few administrative matters. We'd like to ask all of those who are attending and listening to go into mute or listen-only mode to avoid background noise and distractions. So if you do that now, we greatly appreciate it. After each presentation, we will open the floor for Q&A, and we'd invite you to go off mute at that point and submit any questions you'd like to have addressed by the speakers. So with that, I'd like to double check. David, you're with us?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. So let me introduce our first distinguished speaker. This is David Herring. He's the Communication and Education Program Manager at NOAA's Climate Program Office. He leads the climate literacy objective for NOAA's climate mission goal. Before coming to NOAA, David worked for 16 years in the Earth Sciences Division at NASA at the Goddard Space Flight Center, where he served as project manager for education and outreach. He was a team leader for NASA's Earth Observatory and the Terra Satellite Missions Outreach Coordinator. He's a trained journalist in science education, science and technical communications, a graduate of East Carolina University, where he received his master's degree, and he was an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we're delighted to have David with us today to share a little bit about climate change, and that's been a hot topic in the news lately, David, so tell us what's going on.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Are y'all able to see my screen okay?
Yes. We are on my end.
Okay, great. So my contact information is there, and I'm happy also for you all to share copies of this presentation with the participants here or anyone. And if folks have questions, if there's not time to address them today, I'd be more than happy to follow up with folks directly or through the American Horse Council as you wish. Today, I was invited just to share a high-level overview, taking only about 10 to 15 minutes, of the state of Earth's climate system. You know, what do we know, and a little bit about how we know it, and a little bit about what are its implications. So that's what I'll be doing today. I'll also share some details about where folks can go to learn more. Just the upfront infomercial portion, some of you may be very familiar with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Some of you may not be aware of who we are. We're home to the National Weather Service, the National Ocean Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Operational Earth Observation Satellite Program. You might say we go to the ends of the Earth to understand how it works. We study our planet from the surface of the sun to the bottom of the ocean, and we look for causes and effects of change. Where, how, and why might Earth's environment be changing? We're mandated to do this by the Congress, and we're mandated to share the information we gather with the public freely in ways that help guide and inform decision-making and generally enrich society. So that's sort of who we are and what we do. Today, an overview. I don't know if this is blocking the screen or not. Are you guys seeing that window up there? Does that help? The key points today I just wanted to share with you just at a high level. Earth is warming at an unusually rapid rate. I'll say what I mean by unusually rapid. And it's projected to warm by a lot more in this century, by the year 2100. The primary reason for this warming is the human emission of heat-trapping gases. There's a rather lengthy presentation I can give at some point if folks want to know much more detailed about other causes for warming as well as causes of cooling that humans exert on the system. But overall, the upshot or the bottom line is there's an overwhelming warming forcing that's going on. This rapid warming and the resulting climate-related impacts produces harmful and costly extreme events. We've seen quite a few in the last few years. I'll say words about that. The good news is we understand the problem. We have a very good scientific understanding of the Earth's climate system. We have the understanding and the means to slow or even reverse the warming trend if we should so choose to. The vast majority of the scientists agree with these previous four statements. And this is amply supported by the peer-reviewed published literature and a lot of the information that I'll share with you today. And I'm going to share different sources as well where you can go online if you'd like to learn more about some of these and other key points about Earth's climate. So pressing forward, here is a snapshot of the temperature trend from about the year 1880 here on the left through just last year, the year 2016 on the right. This gray line here at the 0 point would be the 20th century average, so from 1900 through 1999. And then every bar is an annual average temperature for the whole planet for that year. And so what you can see is in the period from the 1880 or so right up until just about 1940, we were sort of climatologically speaking in one neighborhood. Through the mid-20th century, we sort of warmed up into another neighborhood where some years were above the average, some years below the average, and we sort of went back and forth a little bit. And then right around 1978, through this past year, we've been stepping up rather rapidly, unusually rapidly, into a different climatological neighborhood, quote unquote, so to speak. And so you may have noticed in the headlines there were a lot of reports, and NOAA and NASA put out reports stating that this was the third consecutive year in a row last year in which Earth's average global temperature set a record high for what has been seen in the observational record. We're about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the 20th century average. And so we're going to get a little bit into why is this and what might that mean. We know this by the thermometer record from around the planet, but we have lots of other indicators as well. So there are lots of things we would expect to see if planet Earth was warming. We would expect to see a decline in our frozen assets in the northern hemisphere, such as glaciers and sea ice, for example. And in fact, we do see a decline in overall in snow in the springtime in the northern hemisphere. We see both shrinking and thinning sea ice in the Arctic. We see rapid loss of ice mass in our glaciers throughout the northern hemisphere, for example. A warmer atmosphere has a greater capacity to hold more water vapor, so we would expect the air to grow more humid as a result of that, and in fact, we're seeing that. So in short, throughout the planet, we're seeing lots of clear signs that the world is warming above and beyond just the thermometer record. I mentioned that this was an unusually rapid rate of warming. And often I'll get the question, well, hasn't Earth warmed and cooled throughout its history? And the answer is yes. It's not unusual for Earth's climate to change. There is natural variability, which happens on relatively short spans of time, and there is long-term climate change. But what had been primarily the driver of climate change on these long periods of time has to do with Earth's orbital mechanics, Earth's orientation relative to the sun. And so there are three ways in which Earth's position relative to the sun changes over very slow periods of time. There's eccentricity. This refers to the shape of the orbit around the sun. It becomes increasingly egg-shaped, and then it sort of becomes more circular. And so there's changes in the eccentricity. The axial tilt or obliquity, this is the axis of rotation relative to the sun. So it sort of slightly changes away from and then towards the sun. And then, of course, there's this behavior that's known as the precession. And this is almost as if to say Earth is behaving like a spinning top, and there might be an imaginary pencil extending from the North Pole, and if this the spinning top has a wobble, and that pencil would be seen to be tracing a circle in an imaginary plane above it, and that's referred to as the precession. And these play out over different time periods, so that on roughly 100,000-year cycles for about the last 2 million years or so, Earth has moved into and out of ice ages. We call those glacial periods, and then the periods of warmth in between the ice ages, we call those interglacials. And what we can see is that what happened is essentially what you're doing is you're changing where and how much sunlight falls on the northern hemisphere, and you are then, that's where most of Earth's land mass is. That's why I'm emphasizing the northern hemisphere. And so when you do that, you begin to nudge the system in a warming direction. You can change it by this orientation relative to the sun by about 1 to 2 watts per square meter, so not much more than, say, a small Christmas tree light bulb for every square meter of Earth's surface. That's the forcing that we'd be talking about. And then with that sustained forcing, there are all kinds of feedback loops that come into play in the system. Cloudiness changes, ice cover changes, the incidence of wildfire changes, and in each of these cases you're changing the energy balance of the planet. And so there's these feedback loops that can accelerate the warming. And this plays out over spans of many centuries, thousands of years, so the rate of change is slow. The magnitude of change would be about between 7 and perhaps 9 degrees Fahrenheit, going from a glacial to interglacial. And so this has occurred naturally. Now, if we look at what's been happening more recently, and so often we'll hear questions like, well, can't this be due to the sun changing? So since the late 1970s, we've had very well-calibrated satellite sensors staring at the sun, measuring total solar irradiance. And we see that the sun's output, or the amount of energy receiving at the Earth, it's fluctuating on these 11-year solar cycles, and so you can see it out through about the year 2007, 2008, and it's remained pretty stable, and this data record, I know, sort of extends even through this past year, where you see these 11-year solar cycles, but overall, there's been no net change. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a little intensification of the sun, and so that may account for as much as, say, 1/10 of the warming in the 20th century. So it could be a small fraction of the overall warming, but certainly not accounting for what we've seen during the most rapid warming experienced on Earth, as indicated by this record here. So there's another record that we have, satellites looking at temperature in the upper atmosphere, or the stratosphere, versus the lower atmosphere, or the troposphere. Areas where you see blues and greens, that means a cooling trend. Areas where you see yellows and oranges and reds, that means warming. If the sun were intensifying, you would expect both upper and lower atmosphere to warm. However, if there was something in the lower atmosphere, say an increase in heat-trapping gases, to catch and contain the heat, then you would expect the lower atmosphere to warm and the upper atmosphere to cool. And that's what the satellite evidence suggests, that we're seeing greenhouse gas warming. So, in fact, we have observing stations around the planet. One of the first ones at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. We've observed an accelerating rate of increase in the decades since 1958. We've now topped out at over 400 parts per million. About a 28% increase in that span of time, 40% increase in carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution. So humans are putting out a tremendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, in the form of methane. These are known and have been known and understood to be heat-trapping gases since the mid-1800s, based on work by John Tyndall using gas spectroscopy. We know that we've been driving up carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. This is a greenhouse gas, or a heat-trapping gas of primary concern. Here we can see from pockets of air trapped in the ice what the carbon dioxide values have been in the atmosphere going back about 800,000 years. You see these sort of these fluctuations playing out over time, and then here we are towards the right-hand side of this graph, looking up for the average of about 200 the year 2011. And now fast forward a few more years, we've topped out at over 400 parts per million. And if we continue on a business as usual trajectory, what we can see is that we will drive the concentration of this heat-trapping gas to way beyond anything our world has seen in millions of years. And so this forcing here in this higher emission scenario represents a radiative forcing of about 8.5 watts per square meter, many times greater than what Earth experienced during those orbital mechanics shifts that I told you played out over very slow time periods. Significantly greater forcing. So this is a rate of change that would be unusually rapid in Earth's history, more than 100 times faster than was experienced due to the natural processes of Earth's orbital mechanics. Every year, NOAA puts out, in partnership with about 380 or so scientists from around the world, an annual document in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society called State of the Climate. And folks can go and read and learn more about that. We publish highlights visually on climate.gov. It's at the web address is climate.gov. And so you can get maps and graphs and textual information written in sort of a popular style. And I'll just sort of glide through just to give you sort of a preview of some of the types of information that you get. And these can be grabbed down and used in publications or presentations, looking at record-breaking number of warm days, for example, around the globe. Drought conditions have been expanding across the globe. A tremendous increase of heat content in the ocean, which is helping to contribute to sea level rise. And there's the sea level rise trend. So these are, and then this is sort of projected levels in global sea level. Is projected to increase this century by at least another foot, probably by upwards of that if you begin to factor in the rapid loss of ice on Greenland and West Antarctica. We could see sea level increases up at around the 6-foot level by the end of the century. So I want to just skip ahead and just say a few last words on why should we care. What we're seeing is a shift in the direction of extremes, so less of the types of Earth events and weather events that we would expect sort of near the bell curve. So an extreme might be the observations that are in the top or bottom 5 or 10% of the observational record in terms of temperature and warm or cold, or in terms of precipitation. And we would expect to see over time sort of a shifting away, fewer record-setting cold days, more record-setting hot days. And then we're also seeing a shift in the precipitation away from light rain events and less drizzle events and more in the form of very heavy downpours. And so these are some of the types of extreme events that scientists are expecting to see, and indeed we have been seeing around the country and around the world. And so these are just a few snapshots just to give some examples of both extreme, California, for example, recently going from extreme drought conditions to very, very heavy downpours in recent days and weeks. In conclusion, I just want to, these are data from Munich Re, the reinsurance company, that has been doing a count of catastrophe events around the world from 1980 through 2014. And so you can see that those events have been on the rise with an overall rising costs of both insured and uninsured losses. So these are data published by Munich Re Insurance. And if folks would like to know more, there's a source online folks can go and access for free. It's the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and it gives a detailed report on what happens across what has been observed to be happening in sectors and regions all across the United States. And there's maps and summary narrative written in sort of plain language that folks can understand. And then lastly, my team and I have developed the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and folks can type in their city or their county and get access to the Climate Explorer, which will allow them to explore at their location. In this case, I entered in Washington, D.C., and you can see the historical period as compared to two different scenarios out into the future for every given county in the contiguous United States in different ways, looking at, say, temperature or, say, the number of days projected above 95 degrees or the number of days projected with minimum below 32 degrees. And so it's an explorer that can help people look at what is projected out into the future for their location. So finally, the National Academy of Sciences has a report series that are freely available out online that folks can access and read if they want to understand more of, well, what can we do about it? So I'll pause there to see if folks have questions or comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Does anybody have questions for David? The toolkit at the end, David's fascinating.
I do a lot. I'll be spending the day tomorrow with FEMA, for example, walking them through the toolkit and helping them learn to use it. And I work with a lot of municipalities and businesses, helping them to learn to use the toolkit. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, I'd be more than happy to share details.
I have a question. This is Katie Patrick. I was wondering,
Katie.
do you have any numbers on or percentages on how much of this might be attributed to animals and livestock versus other causes?
So there is a more detailed breakdown of the relative contributions, and you can find that information, for example, in a report series that's been published by the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they do assessments, and they do a quantitative breakdown of estimates on the relative contributions of things like, say, the cement industry versus, say, burning of coal and fossil fuels versus, say, clearing of forests. And they also look at things like changes of the land surface that affects the radiative, the reflectance versus the absorption of sunlight. So there's a much more detailed quantitatives on the relative forcings and feedbacks of all the different components of the climate system in the IPCC reports. I haven't gotten into that at that level of detail here, but there is information out in the published literature, and I could help you find it if you wanted that type of a breakdown.
Thank you.
Anyone else with a question for David? I'd encourage you, if you have follow-up questions, by all means contact us here at the American Horse Council, or if you can contact David directly and submit some questions, and he'll get. One of us will get back to you.
Yeah, I think maybe if you listed the websites on there that were on the screen, a little hard to track, and we could go back to them. Yeah,
absolutely, you can. I've encouraged the American Horse Council to share a copy of this, and the addresses and those details are in there, and you can refer back to it and come back and explore more at your leisure.
And today's session is being recorded and will be put up on our website. So if you'd like to hear the whole thing again in its entirety or some portion of it, you can do that after probably tomorrow, Ashley, you think?
Yep, it should be up by tomorrow, and I can actually post the presentations immediately after this. So everyone's more than welcome to check the website within the next hour or so.
Thanks, Ashley. Okay, well, thank you again, David. We'll move to our next presenter. Karen, are you with us?
I am.
Wonderful. So welcome, Dr. Karen Davison. Karen is the Director of Equine Technical Solutions with Purina's Animal Nutrition. She has a Master's of Science and a PhD degree in Equine Nutrition from Texas A&M University, where her research included some of the early work investigating the use of added fat in horse diets. Her research focused on the effects of added diets, I'll get that spit out, on reproduction and lactation in brood mares, and on growth, bone development, and thyroid hormones in weanling horses. She spent 8 years with the Texas Agricultural Extension Service prior to joining Purina 23 years ago. She's been published in a number of scientific journals and has authored a number of articles and presented at a slew of meetings across the country on equine nutrition topics. She and her family are also horse enthusiasts. They've done some breeding, some training, and some competing with cutting horses and rodeo performance horses. So, Karen, we're delighted to have you with us. Karen's going to talk to us a little bit about how horses' nutritional needs change when the weather affects us.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, indeed.
Perfect. Well, I would like to start out by saying that Purina is definitely proud of our relationship with the American Horse Council, and we're very happy to be part of this webinar. When we first talked about it and the topic of climate change and equine was told to us, I have to tell you I was a little bit worried about that because that seemed like a very big topic, and David did a nice job in the previous presentation, but I really honestly couldn't figure out exactly what we might say about that. So from my perspective as a horse nutritionist, we reined it in, so to speak, and brought the topic down to seasonal changes or weather changes due to season and looking at the way horse nutrition changes with those seasonal changes. And I think that you'll see, let's see, I'm having trouble. There we go. If you look at the season changes and the weather changes from spring to summer to fall to winter, and you look at these pictures, you can see that there's obviously some differences in the environment for these horses. And so does it make sense that their nutritional changes would change along with those seasons? And the things that I'm having trouble with my own. See what? There we go. I think it's evident that the quality in these pictures and the ambient temperature is definitely different. And the ambient temperature actually affects both the forage quality and the requirements for the horse. And by that I mean that you can look at the picture of a horse in the winter and you can imagine that obviously there's an effect on the forage quality and the amount due to harsh winter conditions, but the ambient temperature definitely affects the forage quality even in the early spring and summer. So you need to understand.
Workforce Center, how may I help you?
Is there someone who might can mute? I'm having a minute,
please.
Talking. So let's go forward. You can see the picture there of the horses in the late summer while the grass is green. I think you'd agree that the grass in that picture is of likely different quality than the grass in the early spring because, again, grass grown in temperatures that are really high will be of a lower quality, even though it may look green and look like a good quality pasture. When grass is grown when it's been 80 degrees, it's of different quality than grass that's been grown at 100 degrees. And then you also have a difference in the activity level of these horses and the difference due to seasonal changes. For a lot of horses, their activity level changes dramatically. So there's lots of things going on with changes in seasons that will affect the nutritional needs of those horses. The primary change is going to be in the forage, and when we think about our horse nutrition, the forage is certainly the foundation of that diet. Forage is in horses is usually 50, but upwards of close to 100% of the diet for a lot of horses is met by forage. And when you look at these two pictures, you see two sets of horses who are eating free choice forage. I think you would agree that the quality of that forage is probably different, and by the forage in these two pictures would be fairly different. So to give you some baselines to start with, wanted to establish that a horse will consume about 2 to 3% of their body weight in dry matter a day. And for a 1,000-pound horse, that's 20 to 30 pounds of dry matter. And it's important to establish that as a dry matter basis as opposed to an as-fed basis, because if you look down here further into the slide, hay is roughly 87% dry matter. Pasture is 20 to 30% dry matter, depending on the time of year and the moisture content and the rainfall and that kind of thing. So you can see that it would take a significantly different amount of pasture to provide the same amount of dry matter intake to the horse as hay. So in this example here, you can see that it takes 35 to 50 pounds of pasture to provide 10 pounds of dry matter, where it only takes 11.5 pounds of hay to provide that same amount of dry matter. And the interesting thing with horses, all animals really, but horses in particular are very susceptible to this, that their voluntary consumption declines when the forage quality declines. So when the hay quality is not good, horses will actually eat less of that hay. So it's a bit of a snowball effect for the horse. If they're eating poor quality hay, they don't eat as much of it, so the total nutrient intake from that hay is diminished. The other thing that's important here is that horses need to get a minimum of 1% of their body weight in hay or the pasture equivalent daily in order to maintain proper gut health and function. So you have to ask yourself when you look out to this green pasture and you see horses out there grazing, does your pasture actually provide nutrition, or is it just a space to roam around in and to be social and to have something to nibble on? And just understand that as a horse owner, we have to do more than just look out and see green. We have to really evaluate what's going on in that pasture. Some of you are familiar with the term spot grazing, and we've all seen pastures where horses are standing in what looks like to be knee-deep pasture, and the horse is grazing in spots of really short, immature grass, and you can't get them to eat that taller grass. Because the taller the grass is, the more mature it is, the less voluntary intake. So you're back to that voluntary consumption. Horses will prefer to bite off that shorter, more immature green pasture. So you need to evaluate whether the horses are eating the pasture uniformly or if they're just spot grazing. A good rule of thumb is to be able to look out. If you can see manure piles, you probably don't have adequate grazing to provide significant levels of nutrition. Horses definitely don't want to graze around manure piles, and if the manure piles are showing, it means the grass is pretty short. So between manure piles and really essentially if you can look out and you can see your horses, the top of the coronary band, then the grass is probably too short to really be supplying all of their nutrition needs. So take some pasture management, deciding how many horses you can keep on that pasture, whether you can keep the herbicide, the weed control, everything to make sure that what's green out there actually is pasture and not just weeds and just something to do. So if you are feeding hay, it's important to know the quality of the hay for your horse, and you can take hay samples and do an analysis, and that's definitely a good way to go if you're storing large quantities of hay. Hay analysis on just a few bales of hay is of limited value. If you're going to get new hay every couple weeks, it gets to be expensive to redo those. And I will tell you, it's important how you take the sample. Just taking a flake of hay or a handful of several flakes of hay is not a really good way to sample hay. So if you can't take a core hay sample and sample several bales and get a really good representative sample of hay that you've got stored for several months supply, and really and truly just a visual appraisal of the hay that you're feeding is probably your best route. And so you want to look for things like a high leaf to stem ratio. You want to have small diameter stems. Depending on the variety of hay, you want to have seed heads or blooms. Seed heads will be in the grass hays, blooms will be in the legumes and the alfalfa hay. You always want to see a fresh smell and appearance and definitely be free of mold, weeds, and other trash, and then look for a bright color. So essentially if the hay is bright and soft and clean, it's probably a good quality hay. But then again, watch your horse's voluntary intake. I think we've all had those experiences where we buy new hay and we buy it from the same supplier and it looks like really good quality hay, and for some reason the horses are leaving more of it or not eating as much of it, and that's just telling you that's a little different quality hay than you had before. The question is, does season affect hay quality? And it definitely does. I get lots of questions about what's the best kind of hay to feed horses, and there's a lot of it depends. It depends on the type of horse, the variety of hay, all those kind of things. But hay quality is affected by plant maturity at time of harvest. I mentioned earlier a little bit about the ambient temperature during the growing period. Again, hay that's grown earlier in the summer that is a lower ambient temperature than that same field growing similar hay later in the year can be very different quality hay. And then the amount of moisture that hay got during the growing period, either excessive rainfall or not enough rainfall, all those can definitely affect hay quality. And again, even in the same supplier, fertilizing properly, and doing everything right, if the climate conditions let him get in there and harvest that hay on time, it can be very different quality hay in a very short period of time. So then the question comes up for a lot of horse owners, is forage all they need? And there's a lot of, it depends, answering that question as well. When you see a picture of a horse like this, you often get the question, is a horse that's fat and shiny automatically healthy? And I would say that a horse that is fat and shiny is definitely probably more healthy than a horse who's fat and dull. But I would also just mention that I personally love to eat potato chips. And I think I can eat enough potato chips to stay fat and shiny, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm healthy. So while fat and shiny is definitely sometimes a goal, it doesn't tell you whether the horse is meeting all their nutritional needs. And, you know, a mature horse at maintenance on a pasture like this may be getting pretty close to all their needs, but a young growing horse or a lactating broodmare or a very hard-working horse would not be. So how do we tell if the horse is getting enough to eat from the pasture? And body condition scoring is the best management tool we have to evaluate that. You can find a description of this on our website. I'll show you the website in the last slide. But basically, the body condition scoring system shows where a horse actually deposits fat, and it gives a number score from 1 to 9 for how fat or thin.
Good afternoon, Moore with Horse Center. This is Meg. How can I help you?
1's a very, very thin horse, and 9's a very, very overweight horse. So the ideal range is between that body score of 5 and 6. So that's the place where we like horses. And this shows you pictures of horses
from
on
9 until 11.
The mare in the top slide is less than a body condition score 4. She's more likely right around a 3, 3.5. And when you have a horse that is this thin, they obviously have reduced energy stores. She doesn't have energy stores to do a lot of work with. She's decreased muscle mass, meaning that she's basically deteriorated muscle to burn for calories, which is not a good thing in an athletic horse. So she'll have reduced stamina.
That would be a little difficult to catch up
on. But the seasonal standpoint is a horse that's this thin will really have a hard time in cold weather. They'll have a hard time maintaining body heat, and that is actually emphasized if they're an older horse. A senior horse that's in this thin of condition will have a harder time than a younger horse.
Well, I don't believe that they do
lower
that
body is not ideal for cold weather. And then the horse in the bottom picture, she's a body condition score about 6, bumping close to a 7. And there's no real benefit for a horse being that fat either, although, you know, handling cold weather during the winter would definitely
why don't I shoot the instructor on email?
She would have a hard time in the hot, humid climates in the summer. So if she was in a hot, humid climate, she would definitely have trouble keeping cool. So there's no benefit for her to being that overweight. The other thing you need to consider is whether you're missing nutrients in good quality pasture. They have adequate calories, protein, and vitamins, but it will definitely be lacking in minerals, and especially trace minerals. And for some horse owners, we think when we put a trace mineral salt block out that that's going to cover all the minerals needed. And a good rule of thumb is if it's as hard as a salt block, it's a salt block. It can be a brown salt block, which means it has trace amounts of trace minerals, but it is not going to be enough mineral to meet the needs of a horse. For instance, if you look at that red salt block there, it's basically 98% salt, and a horse would have to eat 2 pounds of that salt block to meet their copper requirement. So obviously we don't want them eating 2 pounds of that. So the moral of that is to have a true mineral block out or access to mineral for horses even on pasture that are staying fat and shiny, because we know they're lacking in minerals. When you put those horses on good quality hay, they may still have adequate calorie intake, but when you let a forage grow tall enough to cut for hay, and you cut it for hay and you store it, you do have typically a lower protein, vitamin, and mineral content in that hay than you would in the forage the horse would graze in a green pasture. So you need to understand that even good quality hay, if it can keep a horse fat enough, they're still missing out on protein, vitamins, and minerals. And the degree of that deficiency will depend a lot on their age and activity level. And this is something, again, I would point out with senior horses in particular. We see a lot of senior horses who maintain body conditions pretty well through the spring and summer when they have green pasture to graze, because, again, they can select that immature, really good quality grasses to eat, and they can adequately chew and digest that really good quality forage. But when we let that forage get tall enough to make hay, that's different quality forage. And these older horses with impaired dentition, where their teeth aren't as good as they once were, and even if they can actually chew the hay, they often have trouble with their digestive tract not being as efficient as it was when it was younger, and they can't extract all the nutrition out of hay. So we find a lot of cases where older horses' diet needs to change from spring and summer when their base diet is green forage versus hay. So that's something to pay attention to in your older horses, and you'll just begin to see that they'll lose body condition through the fall and winter when the younger horses are maintaining good condition on the same quality hay. So we've talked a lot about body condition, and that is a reflection of whether a horse is taking in enough calories to meet their energy requirements for the day. The other nutrients are a little harder to visually appraise. Protein is about specific amino acid balance. Amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. They're what help decide which type of protein you're going to build. But lots of different tissues and compounds in the body have a protein base, everything from hair coat to muscle tone, hoof quality, and antibodies. There's hormones that have a protein component. So protein is important in a lot of things. If you see that fat, shiny horse who's really soft and doesn't have a lot of muscle tone underneath that, or their hoof growth is tended to slow down, then it's a good indication that you're not meeting their amino acid balance with good quality protein. And then vitamins and minerals, they're even harder to tell when you look at a horse whether you're getting adequate levels of those vitamins and minerals. They're really important for every body function, but they're just not needed in very large amounts. And deficiencies are often not visibly noticeable until the deficiencies are very significant. So the best way to manage that vitamin and mineral nutrition is to make sure that your diet is providing it. It's very hard to look and tell. And a lot of the different things we do to test, there's everything from blood work to hair analysis, lots of different analyses. They're not as reliable on indicating dietary value as you'd hope. So to summarize up, I think we can tell that horses' nutritional needs definitely do change with seasonal changes. And it's important to take all that into consideration and make sure that you are supplementing the forage adequately to provide the protein, vitamin, and minerals when needed and to meet body condition. So, again, you may have a horse who stays fat on forage, but you still need to provide the nutrition that would be missing in the forage. Or you may find seasons of the year where your forage is not being able to meet your horse's body condition. So that's one of the first indicators I would say to look at is pay attention to body condition and make sure you make adjustments in the diet to support improved body condition. Also, when you're picking the product to use, pay attention to recommended minimum feeding rate. There's a lot of feed products out there that are designed to be fed by the pound or by the scoop, so to speak. 4 to 5 pounds is a minimum feeding rate. And if your horse can't eat that minimum amount without getting too fat, you just need to pick a product that's designed to be fed at a smaller feeding rate. And there are ration balancers out there that are designed to be fed at 1 to 2 pound feeding rate. The other thing is pay attention to hay consumption. There's nothing more frustrating than to pay good money for hay that the horse lays on or uses as a bathroom. So we want to make sure that we're feeding hay that horse will eat and that will do them some good. And, you know, we all know that when the weather gets really cold, we feed a little extra hay to give them a little more internal heat because just the heat of digesting that hay helps warm the body through those really cold nights. But if your quality of hay is such that your horse is not eating it, it's not going to do him any good. And then just remember that your feed ration may need to be adjusted somewhat with the season. It may simply be it may be increasing or decreasing the amount of feed required to maintain body condition. But you may, in some situations, again, you may have to actually choose a different product during different seasons of the year so that your horse stays in good condition year-round and doesn't fluctuate up or down with the season. So that's a kind of a quick level view of just some things to consider when your horse is going through seasonal changes. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer some now if we have time. And then if there's questions that you have that we don't get to or that you come up later, you can always email us at our website. And our customer service ladies are very well trained. But if you have a very technical question, they will always forward the question to a nutritionist, and we'll answer. An equine nutritionist will answer your questions as well. So that's seasonal changes in horse nutrition.
Thank you, Dr. Davison. That's really helpful. And as we think about David's earlier remarks and the idea of extreme weather, I think your presentation dovetails nicely with his. Does anybody have questions for Dr. Davison? Okay, well, I'm going to make a switch and reverse our next two speakers because I think it might be a better transition point. So I'd like to introduce Cliff Williamson. I'm fortunate enough to have Cliff on the staff here as our Director of Health and Regulatory Affairs at the American Horse Council. He's a native of Culpeper, Virginia. He grew up on the family horse farm. He's a graduate of Virginia Tech with a degree in animal science. And after graduation, he spent 27 months in the Peace Corps and worked in their food security program. And when he came back to the United States, he spent 4 years in the animal export industry, and we are so delighted to have him on the staff here at the American Horse Council. And Cliff's going to take maybe about 10 minutes, Cliff, and talk a little bit about the disease impacts of climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cliff Williamson, and I am the Director of Health and Regulatory Affairs here at the American Horse Council. Today I'll plan on speaking on the concerns raised by warming temperature trends here in the United States and the effect of those trends on bugs in quotations, and particularly photogenic marsupial. Regardless of cause, a change in climate creates new risks, particularly in the United States for exposure to vector-borne diseases, which are diseases transmitted through the bites of insects, who are referred to as vectors, which carry disease-causing pathogens. Maybe my screen may work. Common vectors include mosquitoes, ticks, flies. Parasites and viruses are agents of disease in humans, livestock, crops, wildlife. For animal health, key effects of changing climate include the risk of increased occurrence of infectious diseases. Many pathogens have a high potential for expansion within a new environment, particularly when the insect hosts are exposed to a sympathetic climatic change or comfortable conditions overall. Changing climate creates new uncertainties about the spread of these diseases by altering conditions that affect the development and dynamics of the disease vectors and the pathogens themselves. Opportunities for change include regional distributions, life cycle trends, associations within ecosystems, virulence of the diseases and pathogens, and a pattern of infection. Insect vectors have several physical traits that help them take advantage of climate impacts like flooding, increased precipitation, and warmer weather. For example, body temperature. Insects cannot regulate their body temperature and are dependent on external warmth to survive. Rising temperatures in the United States may cause vector ranges to shift, increasing risks of exposure to new populations. Another example is breeding. Humidity and water are crucial for vector breeding, so more insects can hatch in areas with standing water and higher precipitation. Another example is pathogen incubation. The incubation period of pathogens and diseases within vectors is also temperature dependent and becomes a shorter incubation period in warmer conditions. Thus, the bugs in quotations grow a little faster when the temperature is right. Importantly, rising temperatures can lengthen the season and increase the geographic range of disease-carrying insects. On this slide, you can see as temperatures warm, vectors can move into higher altitudes and new regions altogether. For instance, in some regions of the United States, warming has lengthened the season for mosquitoes and the prevalence of the diseases that they carry. Also of note, increased rainfall, flooding, and humidity creates more viable areas for vector breeding and allows breeding to occur more quickly as eggs hatch faster in hotter climates. For example, in the United States, the mosquito season has grown in 76% of major cities since the 1980s due to increases in hot and humid weather conditions. A report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated that vector-borne diseases are some of the best-suited diseases associated with climate change due to their widespread occurrence and the vector's sensitivities to their environments. While the direction of change is difficult to predict, there is mounting evidence that certain vectors, such as mosquitoes, are changing their range. For example, Eastern equine encephalitis and West Nile virus are emerging in areas that are previously unknown, and there is mounting evidence that this is due, in part, to increasing temperatures. According to the World Health Organization, there are 3 key components that determine the occurrence of vector-borne diseases. These are vector and host abundance, local prevalence of disease-causing parasites and pathogens, and susceptible population behavior and disease resilience. Climate change that affects these 3 key components include changes in temperature, precipitation, as this slide shows, humidity, and other factors that influence the reproduction, development, behavior, and population dynamics of insects, pathogens, and in our instance, horses. Vector-borne disease cycles are complex because of constantly changing interactions between pathogens, the insects, and the horses themselves. Changes in climate make these interactions less predictable, multiplying the risk of the disease. In the United States, projected increases in spring, summer, and fall temperatures will continue to increase the total number of days each year when temperatures fall between 50 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature window in which mosquitoes thrive. Projections for more heavy downpours may also increase the threat from these vectors and the subsequent diseases they carry. Future risk depends on many factors. The American Journal of Preventive Medicine reports that predicting the impact of climate change on vector-borne diseases requires long-term studies that look at other agents of global change, such as increased trade, travel, demographic shifts, civil unrest, changes in land use, and importantly, water availability, many of which intersect heavily with climate change. The World Health Organization estimates that rising global temperatures as well as altered precipitation and humidity linked to climate change could significantly alter diseases and their effect, making outbreaks more difficult to predict and control. These changes in diseases would likely occur as both short-term epidemics and long-term gradual changes to the disease trend themselves. For example, Lyme disease is the most commonly reported vector-borne illness in the United States. Lyme disease is caused by the bite of an infected tick. Traditionally, Lyme disease was concentrated heavily in the Northwest and Upper Northeast and Upper Midwest. Today, these ticks live in 44% more counties than they did in 1996. That's spread over 43 different states. The most dramatic changes were visible in the northern U.S., where climate change is predicted to increase their habitats. Since 1990, average daily temperatures in the United States have increased by approximately 0.4 degrees Celsius. The hydrological cycle is also changing, with increases in cloud cover and precipitation, both of which help the tick population to grow. Additionally, mosquitoes need warm, humid climates to survive and thrive. Mosquito vector-borne diseases that were once unable to spread to cooler, less humid areas can now migrate since the climate is warming. An example for this is the Eastern equine encephalitis virus, commonly called EEE or sleeping sickness, which is transmitted by the bite of an infected mosquito. Mosquitoes become infected by feeding on diseased birds, and infected mosquitoes will then feed on horses and humans, spreading the illness. EEE could very likely spread to areas and climates outside the warm, humid regions we commonly associate it with. Massachusetts, during the summer, reports a few cases each year. Vermont, a state with no history of EEE, reported in 2010 that the native moose and deer populations are now endemic with the virus. In 2011, Vermont also reported to have several large emu flocks die from EEE. The Equine Disease Communication Center reported this year that Wisconsin had 19 cases occurring as late as October 28. New York, New Jersey, and Michigan all reported their own cases of EEE this year. This evidence shows an obvious change in EEE's locations and patterns and is quite clearly spreading to climates once considered safe. A final culprit that needs to be identified is the unassuming possum. The only native North American marsupial, which is a known carrier of equine protozoal myeloencephalitis, or EPM. While the points I raised earlier as to how insects can capitalize on the change in temperature may not apply to the mighty possum, the warming trend has allowed this pernicious creature to move further north than ever before. The constant threat of frostbite that had kept possums from enjoying certain states' hospitality, as any cold weather citizens can now attest, can only keep ugly out for so far. As rainfall levels change and seasons shift, horses will be exposed to new and more virulent strains of pathogens, putting pressure on our veterinary health systems. While the topic of the cause of this change continues to be discussed in Washington, the ramifications of the change itself will necessitate a cultural shift in equine owners and the practitioners alike, as each will be expected to recognize the new set of threats and concerns. Thank you for your time, and please feel free to contact me with any comments or questions you may have regarding this or any other health and regulatory concerns. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cliff. Has anybody got some quick questions for Cliff? We are running a few minutes behind schedule, and we have one more presenter today, so we hope you'll be able to stick with us. Feel free to contact Cliff. He's a wealth of information. I'm sure he'd be happy to direct you to any of the sources that he quoted or try to help you address whatever questions you might have. Okay, well, we have tried on each of our webinars to have an opportunity for the attendees to meet one of the American Horse Council organizational members, and what better to do in the area of climate change than to meet those folks from the Backcountry Horsemen of America. We're fortunate to have Jim McGarvey with us this afternoon. Jim is the chair of the American Horse Council's Recreation Committee. He's executive director and past national chairman of Backcountry Horsemen of America. He's going to take a few minutes to get us acquainted with Backcountry Horsemen of America and tell us a little bit about what they do, so you guys will get to know him. Go for it, Jim.
Thank you, Julie, very much. It's good to talk to you all. I think what I'm going to try to accomplish here today is to leverage some of the information that we gather, our folks gather when we have 14,000 members. Spend a lot of time in the backcountry, out in the field, and kind of see what the effects of global warming are. And to start with, also a little bit of a background on the Backcountry Horsemen of America, and I will move right along, Julie.
Hi, can I help you? What was the name?
If everyone can put their phones on mute, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, let me just go from this direction. Can you see me there?
We sure can.
Okay, I'm going to do it on this one. I'll give you briefly what Backcountry Horsemen do, how we got here, where we are now, what our challenges are, and speak directly about climate change. This is our 5 credos, if you will, of what we do to perpetuate common sense and to work to ensure the public lands remain open, to assist the government to educate and encourage and to foster new organizations. But really what we do is we keep the trails open for everyone. If you can get a horse or even a pack mule down a trail, pretty well everyone can get down that trail. And so our work is out on America's trails. And we keep the America's trails open really in 3 ways. Hooves and boots on the ground. We've been doing this for 44 years, clearing trails of deadfall, debris, and erosion. A lot of deadfall to trees, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Trail maintenance and design, maintaining trailheads and packing and equipment. That's a quite a skill of its own over the centuries, and we do so much more. We also work very heavily in education, training, trail safety and design, chainsaw and certifications.
You have to be enrolled in a program first.
And I think that person's talking again on the phone, if she could mute. And we teach leave no trace. Our third way of going through this is advocacy. We work at the federal and state. Every 10 to 12 years, the national forests and national parks have to do a new management plan, and a lot of it is now being affected by climate change, their plans. So a lot of science is brought into these plans, and we work with them to ensure that the equines can still have access to the trails in the back country and the front country of the national parks and national forests. And a lot of the old saws have gotten thrown away that the horses bring in alien weeds and that. We found that not to be the case as we keep working on this type of thing. Back up, in 1 year, this is interesting to give an example of what we do.
I will give you this to
if we could ask that person to just put on mute, but never mind.
Hand that over to Emily to see if you're...
It sounds like somebody's multitasking, Jim. I think you're just going to have to talk over her.
Well, I'll talk over. I can do that. So in 1 year alone, we did 410,000 hours as an example year, and that equates using the IRS tables as $15 million, probably about a minimum of $4 million out of pocket. We'd all own horses and mules if we didn't do backcountry horseman work, but it costs more to do what we do, get out there, different kinds of trailers, stronger trucks, and so 1 year about $19 million. I'll come back to that. So how we got here, this is interesting. In 1973, and I want to touch on this because it kind of taps on today even, the Wilderness Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964, right. And we didn't know, a lot of folks didn't know exactly what the Wilderness Act meant. Did that mean before Columbus came, to bring our land back before Columbus, before the Indo-American people came over, just back to paradise? Didn't know what it meant, and so there's a lot of hand-wringing then. And in 1973, that spring, the heavy snows washed out the bridges in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and that was one of the original wilderness named after the fellow that pushed the wilderness movement, Bob Marshall. And so we worked with the Forest Service to put in bridges, and it became quite a well-known event. That's actually news spread around the country about what we were doing, because instead of suing the Forest Service, there was a group of folks that said, we'll help you. They packed in 1,600 mule loads of equipment over a year and a half to build those bridges back. And so that started us. Then in the 70s, we grew and grew and grew. 2010s we're growing. We got to the East Coast, heading on up the coast. And so we've here we are in 2017 with 14,000 members, about 200 chapters across the country. So we have a good feeling of what's going on in the woods. And so this is a little sidebar I want to put in. But so that's where our members are, but where are the horses and mules? And this is the 2005 American Horse Council study. Please donate and help with a new study coming up this year to update this whole census. And this is all equines, wild mustangs and mules and racing horses and our backyard horses. But you'll see that the first 5 states, Texas, California, Florida, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, that seems logical to be those top 5 states. I grew up in Ohio, and I didn't see that many horses. It must have been a different part of the state, but this is an interesting thing. But what you do go on the second part, you'll see more of the western states have the lower number of horses as a ratio. Connecticut, interestingly, has the highest per capita horse to people population, just a little side note. But and then this is the equine population by region of the country, with those southern horses leading the way. Now, this is the challenges the BCH faces in its day-to-day operations and going into the future. And the big challenge, it's really kind of blossomed a little bit more here in the past few months. The budget rules, regulations, we've all had that, at the federal level, and a lot of regulations. But with the new administration, there's a hiring freeze, I think, in the complete federal government, and I do believe there is one, I know, on the Forest Service. And so they locked in with with their budgets, and I'll get back to that, and with the number of people that can keep these trails open. So those are some problems we have. So what we do is we have memorandums of understanding with the National Park Service and Forest Service and Wilderness Society, and that which allows us to go into the back country and the front country of parks, national forests at the local level. They say we've been signed off on in Washington, so we must be okay to go ahead and work with them, and a lot of folks known us for decades. But the interesting thing then is the bigger challenge is the land and the trails, lots of both. And this is the amount of land in acres across the United States. Bureau of Land Management leads the way. The Forest Service second, another 93 million. That's Fish and Wildlife. A lot of that is in Alaska, the 89 million, the National Park Service. And state parks are 14 million. So there's a lot of land out there to be taken care of. But more interestingly, even though, is the amount of trails on these lands. And if you look at the Forest Service, 158,000 miles, it dwarfs all the rest of them put together. To put that in perspective, 158,000 miles is 6 times around our planet at the equator. That's how many trails the Forest Service has. And a little bit interestingly, just in the Forest Service, our people did 1.4 volunteer hours per trail mile 6 times around the planet in 1 year for the Forest Service. So we get out there and see what's going on. And so some of the things we've seen what's going on with our climate change and climate variability, it's kind of becoming a snowball, to put it mildly, or a fireball. Is the 3 trail challenges I want to speak to very quickly today. Western pine beetle, the wildfire crisis, and a 5-year drought that killed over 100 million trees. Speaking to the western pine beetle, that's the bark and wood-boring beetle. It's the largest insect blight in North American history that's known. And it covers, this is about the lands west of the 100th meridian that was discovered in Colorado. And there's, depending what part of the forest you're in, all you see is miles and square miles of just brown of the dying trees. And this has been increasing in the past 2 decades. And I think with Cliff Williamson speaking to the fact that insects, bugs cannot regulate their own temperature, that in prior decades and centuries, these bark beetles and pine beetles would die off and then have to, at the higher temperatures because of the colder temperatures, the higher elevations because of the colder temperatures, and then crawl their way back up and then die off and then crawl back. And so they really did not make very much of an impact in the higher elevations. Well, today it's making a huge impact. And but interestingly, so there below you'll see I've underlined the southern pine beetle. I'm here in North Georgia, and I left Ohio in '78 with all the horses, and down here in North Georgia. And I want to show you the southern pine beetle infestation was really rather dramatic. It's green, and I'll tell you why I've made these states green looking. The pine beetle in the south started about 3 decades ago, and has kind of ran its course. And why it's greening, they even ate away. You can see at my state of Mississippi borderlines there. But the pine beetle, what they did, they killed the trees, the pine trees, which then opened up the land to the seeds of the hardwoods that had been there possibly for a long time. And so what we have now is the trees, the first hardwoods, the American chestnut blight killed the American chestnuts in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. The blight came in Long Island, started up here, and it was said that a squirrel could get on top of a chestnut tree in New Hampshire and would never touch the ground until it got to Florida. That's how many chestnut trees they are. And now I belong to the American Chestnut Society, and we go looking for the rare chestnut tree that lives to 5 years and try to pollinate it, and it will achieve some success. But what's happening is the hardwoods are coming back in the south, but going north, the southern pine beetle is heading on up into New York State, and so I've left this tan, but there are places that are red with the blight as the southern pine beetle moves north, again affected by the temperature, my summation. Then we have the wildfire crisis, the second big issue. I'm going to use the impacts on the Forest Service because we're working with them so closely and have to deal with this. And that is, just to summarize it, some of the impacts, if you'll see this, the growth of it, from 1985 to 1989, that 5-year period, the expenditure by the Forest Service just on fire suppression, putting out fires, was $371 million a year average for each of those 5 years average. In the last 5 years, it has grown to nearly $2 billion a year, and the same is happening in Alaska. I mean, for instance, northern Canada and Alaska to some degree. So it's a 5-fold increase. And what's happened here is the fire costs have grown from 16% of the Forest Service budget to 55%. And the budget stays flat. Congress is not increasing the budget at all and doesn't look to be happening. And their staff is down 35% since 1995. And so the Forest Service has a big problem, and it's probably best exemplified with the climate change, the wildfires, and the budget is all swirling around into one big mess for the U.S. Forest Service. The next thing that I'll point out was the 5-year drought in Northern California, 2010-2015. It's pretty well washed out now with the recent rains and floods, as mentioned by our first speaker. What happened, this drought really impacted the Sierra Nevada mountains over that 5-year period, 5 to 6 year period. And the results of that 5-year drought was 102 million dead trees, if you can even grasp that dimension. You can, maybe it's 8 million acres of devastation. 8 million acres is 20% of the state of Washington, which has some of this issue too. But 8 million acres of devastation. The western pine beetle also jumped in and helped out to get the trees that hadn't died. They made them die faster in the drought because they were weakened, and the beetle was out there working away too, adding to those trees. And to give an example, the kind of the high cost, just in 2 California highways, Governor Brown approved $6.5 million to start clearing trees, but they haven't come close to it yet. But it costs about $1,000 a tree. When you're working the highways, on 2 highways, they have to take down 30,000 dangerous trees because of motorists. So there's already been a loss of life on motorists with this. And also, as kind of symbolic of this, was the loss of the 250-year-old Pioneer Cabin tunnel tree. I think we've all seen on the postcards and on TV, and that collapsed through this. So what I want to do is very briefly to go through and explain what the backcountry horsemen do and why what we're seeing out there. This is causing complete trails to collapse with phenomenal amount of trees within 1 mile, hundreds and hundreds of trees that we have to clear within 1 mile. And some of these trees are monsters out in the northwest corner of the United States. And so this is adding to our backlog. The Forest Service is falling behind in their fire and their financial backlog. And so the climate variability and climate change is having a big impact out on America's trails, where according to the American Quarter Horse Association, of their 250,000 members, the main reason 62% of them have horses is because they ride trails. So it does have a big impact on the equine industry. And thank you, Julie.
Well, thank you,
and
Jim.
Ashley.
I think that's a nice closing there. Does anybody have questions for Jim? It ties it all together. Well, again, we thank you for joining us today. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them to us at the American Horse Council or to the respective presenters, and we'll get those addressed. I wanted to let you know that we will have another quarterly webinar on May the 15th, and you will be receiving a survey probably tomorrow from us asking for your thoughts about today's webinar and for suggestions for future topics for webinars. We look forward to hearing your comments and your suggestions. And again, we thank you for attending. As Ashley said, the recording will be up very shortly, and she also has copies of the presenter's slides if anyone would like to see copies of those. So thank you for joining us today, and have a good day.
Thank you.